couple hours of the presentation that shows your attendance. Please keep that for your records. If you are applying for COVA's Voluntary Victim Advocate Certification and you're using this training, you will need to submit that email with your records. If you're watching this training later online on YouTube, we hope you find it useful. However, please note that archived webinars may not be used towards COVA's Voluntary Victim Advocate Certification. In order to receive the email, you may need to whitelist the domain logmein.com or go to webinar. And if I'll put my info in the chat box here in a second, if you have any problems, just go ahead and contact me after the webinar, and I will monitor the chat box. Any audio problems, let me know, and Lise will take questions at the end. And with that, Lise, take it away.
Thanks so much. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to take a listen to this webinar. This is like my second time teaching a webinar. It is so different from teaching in front of people. Yeah, I'm learning as I go. So what we're talking about today is nuances of DV dynamics. And when I talk about nuances, what I've really focused on during this presentation is a lot of the research surrounding DV dynamics. I think a lot of times, at least for DAs, we tend to kind of take a 30,000-foot view when we look at DV. We learn by doing, we learn by anecdotes, we kind of use that to propel what we do and how we communicate with other people. But I am somebody who loves research. For whatever reason, I think the research and the peer-reviewed kind of aspect of things is really fascinating. And I also think that sometimes it's best to learn from those who really put the work in rather than just use the anecdotes. Anecdotes are still helpful, but that's why this webinar is going to be basically research focused, because I don't ever want to assume someone's just going to take my word for it. I want them to kind of look at what the research is out there. I've distilled it all for you. And my hope is that by kind of learning some of this, it will influence maybe the way you interact with the victim going forward, or maybe some of those judgments we're kind of predisposed to having. Even those of us who have been doing this for a long time are predisposed to having about victims and their interactions with the justice system and their interactions with us. Certainly a lot of what we see with victim behavior is counterintuitive, but understanding why that counterintuitive behavior exists can really help us going forward and figuring out how to interact with them. So I will take a look at questions at the end in the chat box, just so I don't have to toggle between screens. But for those of you, if you don't feel comfortable asking a question in the chat box, totally fine. I have my email address and my phone number at the end. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff offline. I love talking about this research and talking about people's experiences. So never hesitate contacting me. It's one of my favorite parts of the job. So again, just talking about nuances of DV dynamics. I found this background screen on PowerPoint when I was getting ready for this, and chose this vaguely 90s grade school PowerPoint screen because it makes me feel like I was in grade school. But it also, with its multiple colors, makes up for the lack of color for the remainder of the presentation. So absorb it now while you can, and we're going to go ahead and move on to white screens going forward. But rest assured, it's white screens filled with lots of information. So just to kind of give you a basic about what we're going to talk about today. So we got a couple things on the agenda. I always like starting out with statistics. I, to this day, will appear in front of judges who have been doing this for a long time, and they simply don't know the statistics and the reporting surrounding domestic violence. For a lot of them, I've heard them say if they only knew those statistics, it would impact the kind of bonds that they set in cases and the kinds of sentences they impose. My hope is that by knowing these sorts of statistics and some of the other research surrounding just the dynamics themselves, that we can kind of shift the way judges and other professionals in the criminal justice system think about domestic violence, as well as kind of use this to help those kind of in the general public think about domestic violence. Turns out, if you kind of, one thing I saw a couple years ago when I was doing a different presentation was some of the memes surrounding those of you who remember the Chris Brown, Rihanna domestic violence incident, where on the way to the Grammys, Chris Brown assaulted Rihanna. She had photos taken and there were multiple injuries on her face. It is amazing to me that there were myriad memes that came out after that, as well as articles, forums, those kinds of things, that blamed Rihanna for being basically not a good girlfriend or that kind of thing. So we in this profession think that because we've moved on from these antiquated views of domestic violence as the woman is not doing what she should do, that the rest of the world and the rest of the nation and the rest of the state has also moved on from that as well. The fact of the matter is those kinds of sentiments are alive and well, and the more we can educate those around us, the better. We'll talk a little bit about why victims stay in abusive relationships. A lot of us kind of know this idea that victims stay in abusive relationships because of the cycle of violence, but there's kind of more to that victim behavior and understanding that victim behavior. So the more that we can learn about that, the more we can interact with victims in ways that is empathetic towards that behavior, because really it just kind of boils down to psychology and to someone's circumstances. And I think we do need to respect that as professionals and act in a way that understands that. We'll talk about increasing victim cooperation and how we do that, and how we get victims to better cooperate in the criminal justice system. I'm going to have a section on the role of empathy. I'm somebody who, in my everyday life and in my professional life, I really strive to be an empathetic person. And I think that's something each and every one of us should strive to be. I think the more empathy we show towards others, the more we not only connect with other human beings, but we kind of make the world a better place that way. Empathizing towards victims and trying to put yourself in their shoes and understanding what they're going through. While we could never understand what they experience, empathy turns out to be a very powerful tool in helping victims cooperate in prosecutions and helping them move past the abusive relationships that they either were in or are currently in. We'll end with a little section on sentencing considerations based on the research. The purpose of that is to kind of look a little bit more into what sorts of things we should be thinking about when we're crafting sentences in domestic violence cases based on the research. So just a quick note about the research. The majority of the research focuses on the female victim and the male batterer. There's multiple reasons this could be the case. One is this traditional feminist perspective that found battering to be strictly masculine. Another reason is frankly that LGBTQ research into relationships and battering is really limited. There's some work being done on this now, but the work needs to be definitely more widespread. We know that battering happens in same-sex relationships just as it does in heterosexual relationships, and understanding that more and finding out more about the LGBTQ battering relationship is something that we all need to do more of, both as researchers and understanding as professionals. Finally, the research into the area of battered men is limited, and I think there's more being done on that area. So just know that when I talk about her as the victim, him as the offender, I'm doing that based on the research and based on what I have read, but that doesn't mean that that is exclusive, right? There are certainly female offenders with male victims. There are certainly offenders in same-sex relationships. That's not lost on me. I'm simply making the statements based on the research. So starting out with the statistics, something that I think is very striking for a lot of people and what a lot of people wouldn't know is that domestic violence is still very widespread. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience DV in their lifetime. There's other research that talks about 61% of women have been physically abused by an intimate partner. The CDC research, of course, uses that umbrella term of domestic violence, which can also include emotional violence. But the physical violence statistics get a little bit different. Other types of statistics talk about 41% of females and 14% of males sustain physical injury. So just know that kind of whichever way you cut that, the number is pretty high as far as those who are experiencing physical abuse from their partners. The thing that all the research suggests and agrees upon is that males are more likely to re-abuse than women. And this is an interesting statistic for habitual domestic violence charges and when you're looking at a habitual offender. For those men who were initially identified as a victim and subsequently identified as a suspect later, 41% of those men were subsequently identified as a suspect when they were initially identified as a victim 2 years prior. That's in contrast to women, where only 26% of women were subsequently identified with that kind of role reversal. So why that is, don't know. We don't really have a lot of findings surrounding that, but interesting to know that when we're talking about habitual offenders, we're more likely to see males charged again than we are to see women charged again. Recanting is obviously something that is huge in the area of domestic violence. 90 to 95% of victims recant at some point in time. This is a really important statistic to not forget, because knowing that that much recant happens is really helpful in kind of combating those ideas that, well, if someone's recanting, they lied in the first place. We know there are multiple reasons why someone might recant. We'll talk about those in a few, but know that it is almost every single victim who comes through the criminal justice system ends up recanting. And part of that is the fact that it takes 7 to 9 times to leave a relationship before a victim leaves for good. Again, multiple reasons why that's the case. The other thing to know is when someone leaves a relationship, women are 70 times more likely to be killed in that first 2 weeks after leaving a relationship, but it doesn't end there, right? That continues for the first year after the victim decides to leave the relationship. So we know that those first 2 weeks are extremely dangerous, but the vigilance kind of can't end with that first 2 weeks. We really got to keep an eye on those cases at least through the first year, hopefully for longer than that as well. DV homicide victims are predominantly women as well. Taking a quick look at some of the statistics in Colorado. So I've got kind of old statistics in here, but nonetheless, 2016 wasn't so far away that it's not instructive here. So in 2016, there were 56 homicides in Denver. 11 of those 56 were related to DV. So about a fifth related to DV, which is a pretty high number. What you'll see later in the research is that usually abuse continues for kind of quite a while before we kind of get to these sorts of homicide statistics. So every case that we can intervene in, getting to that homicide, the more work we're doing to prevent the homicide in the future. Multiple ways to do that. We've seen other states impose certain policies that help reduce those homicide numbers. Interestingly, lethality risk assessments are huge in getting reductions in those homicide numbers. They saw that in Maryland, where the lethality risk assessment was developed and is kind of the pinnacle of the lethality risk assessment. But of course, even no drop prosecution policies, you'll see in a couple later slides, are huge, specifically in San Diego. When San Diego developed no drop prosecution policies, they had huge impacts on the reduction of homicides in that county. Of those 11 of 56 homicides that were DV related in 2016, every single homicide victim was a woman, excuse me. That's interesting to note when you know that of all the homicide victims in Denver in 2016, 12 women were homicide victims. So that means 11 of the 12 were related to DV. Nationally, murder-suicides also largely involve intimate partners. Those don't get prosecuted, and so we don't see those statistics nearly as much. Those statistics don't resonate with us nearly as much simply because we are looking more in the prosecution kind of context of things. But that really puts into perspective that it doesn't end right just with homicide. Murder-suicide is very instructive on the DV front as well. And of course, predominantly the victims of murder-suicide are going to be women as well. Children, I think, are often lost when we're talking about domestic violence and domestic violence dynamics, but they shouldn't be lost, and we shouldn't overlook those charges of child abuse where a child is present. when a domestic violence situation occurred. So we know that when a child is exposed to parental violence, they become extremely more likely to experience violent victimization later in life than those children that grew up in non-abusive households. And that risk ends up being way higher for boys, way higher for girls versus for boys, 115% higher for boys and 229% higher for girls. So we know that addressing domestic violence starts oftentimes with kids and making sure kids are in safe spaces. Interestingly, this type of abuse, experiencing abuse, growing up in a violent household, also has an impact on a child's brain. We know that an abused brain, based on scans, ends up being way underdeveloped compared to a healthy brain of a kid who didn't grow up in that kind of household. And the things that don't get developed are, guess what? The temporal lobes, those things that are responsible for helping regulate emotional function in the child. So not only do we see a lot of children who grow up in abusive households normalizing abuse later in life, becoming a victim of abuse later in life, but they actually have physical underdevelopment compared to children with healthy households and who experience healthy relationships. The other thing we know about domestic violence that we really don't talk about at all is that reporting on average is pretty low. Only about 62% of victims report domestic violence, meaning for those people who handle domestic violence cases, they're seeing only about 62% of the cases that are happening in that county. We really only talk about low reporting with sex assault, but I think we also need to kind of address this with respect to domestic violence. There are multiple reasons why abuse may not be reported. I think it's fascinating that that top reason is going to be that abuse is a private or personal matter. I would think that probably the majority of people on this webinar think that that is an antiquated or outdated view. Guess what? It's not. It's not even outdated for those individuals who are experiencing the abuse themselves. And if that's the case, it's certainly not going to be outdated for those individuals who are making up jury pools. Fear of reprisal is obviously kind of a given with a reason for not reporting abuse. Desire to protect the suspect gives some insight into that counterintuitive victim behavior we'll talk about a little later. But then this one, the belief that the police won't do anything, that's going to be huge, right? And that's where all of us come in and can help combat that view of the justice system of just kind of ferreting cases through, coming into conclusions, and then victims never hear from us again. That's where the work really can be done in the criminal justice system, and we'll talk about kind of how that work can be done. The other thing to note is that the majority of people don't report the initial assault. So most of the cases we're seeing, those are going to be re-assaults. That's going to be recidivism. It's not going to be that very first assault. So that gives some insight into when we're talking to a victim about what happened that day, maybe we should go beyond talking about what happened that day and kind of look into what the arc of the relationship was when the assault started to happen, what the defendant said, and kind of how we got back to that point. This is really interesting, is that victim confidence in law enforcement can lead to new reports of violence. And we're not just talking about victims being happy with law enforcement from the very beginning. We're talking about victims who are even opposing the arrest of the abuser at the very beginning, but then re-reporting later, and giving some insight into the fact that even when the victim is saying, hey, I don't want this person arrested, she's still going to re-report down the road. And that's great, right? Because I think a lot of us probably feel that cognitive dissonance or that dichotomy between wanting to respect the victim's wishes, wanting to give her self-determination, wanting to not act paternalistic, but then recognizing that the victim that may actually help the victim down the road. I don't want to use the word paternalism to say that that's going to help the victim, but knowing that sometimes doing something that is contrary to the victim's wishes will actually end up enhancing safety in the future. So just kind of keep that in your thought. This is the important part. When the criminal justice response was insufficient, or the victim felt that it endangered them, then they're not going to report subsequent victimization. So that's the big thing, is not just kind of letting things fall on the back burner and saying, whatever, this person doesn't want to participate in this prosecution or participate in the criminal justice system, so let's throw this case off to the side. That's kind of the exact opposite thing of what we need to do in order to increase victim confidence in law enforcement. So knowing some of the statistics surrounding domestic violence reporting and victims staying in relationships and how often that happens, it really kind of begs the question of why victims stay in relationships. And I think we need to know why victims stay in DV relationships, not only to inform how we're communicating with juries, to inform how we're communicating with the public, but frankly, to inform how we're communicating with victims themselves. If we don't kind of understand the psychology behind the victims' decisions and why they're doing what they're doing, it becomes really hard to connect with that victim and to kind of get them on board with the decisions we're making, or even get them to understand the decisions they're making, right? So when we talk about why victims stay in DV relationships, I think we have to go way back to that very first kind of element of how we learn as individuals. There is a psychologist out there, his name is Chris Wilson, and he teaches a lot on neurobiology of trauma. If you ever get the chance to take some seminar with him or go see him speak, absolutely take that opportunity. He is amazing in discussing the neurobiology of trauma. He talks a lot about how we learn is that we map the world around us, right? So for example, I am standing in a room right now, and I have mapped this room completely subconsciously. I know there's a window to my right. There is a door at the 1 o'clock position from where I'm standing. Out, there's another room outside that door. There's a hallway outside that room. I know all these things without even having to think about it, because the very first time I walked into here, I mapped subconsciously what was going on around me. You've all done that in the rooms that you're sitting in now too. And we do that for places we walk into, and we also do that for items that we see in the world, right? If you, a little kid sees a four-legged creature with a tail and ears, and they point to it and their parent says doggy, and that kid's like, okay, doggy. And then they see another four-legged creature that has a tail and ears and fur, and they point to it and they say doggy, and their mom says, no, no, that's a cat, right? So that child has learned to map initially the four-legged creature to a dog, and they have to kind of relearn to map it to a cat for something that's slightly different. We learn every single thing that's surrounding us that exact same way. We do the exact same thing for humans, right? So we map not only the people in our life in a particular way, our family, our friends, but we also map our intimate partners in a particular way. And here's the thing. We don't see abuse starting in a relationship until at least 6 months on average into the relationship. Abuse doesn't start on average 2 weeks in, right? Because 2 weeks in, we haven't had enough time to map that person to safety. And part of the thing we need to not lose sight of is that domestic violence is a pretty sophisticated way to manipulate another human. Whether or not the individual who is using domestic violence is sophisticated, the fact of the matter is DV messes with our minds so much psychologically that it is hard for our minds to grasp it. That's why it's so different from stranger assaults. Strangers, we have not mapped at all. We don't have any preconceptions about how that person's going to treat us. It is very easy if a stranger assaults us to say that person is bad. But with an intimate partner, we've already mapped that person to safety because the abuse doesn't start until we get 6 months into the relationship. What Chris Wilson talks about is that we map that person to be a dolphin. They do nice things for us. They say nice things for us. They're kind in general to us. And then they do something bad that makes them look like a shark. And then we've got this cognitive dissonance in our mind where we say, wait a second, I mapped that person. I've lived my life knowing them as a dolphin for the past 6 months, at least, if not more. And now they're doing something that makes them look like a shark. And how do I reconcile that in my mind? And here's the thing with DV, right? It's a cycle. And so they go right back to looking like a dolphin. And then we say to ourselves, oh yeah, that person's exactly what I thought they were. They're the dolphin. And it continues again and again. We all have that in our own lives with friends, for example. If we have a great friend, they do something that's horrible to us, and then we end up forgiving them. We end up letting them go back to being a dolphin and doing something kind, except typically our friends don't assault us, right? So DV is so pernicious because it uses these horrible methods of violence against individuals, and yet goes right back to looking like they're a dolphin. And in addition to knowing how we learn, don't forget the fact that intimate relationships are also these primary human needs, right? We have this need to belong to people around us. We are social beings, and so much of that belonging is modifying our behavior in service of that belonging. And so think about the victim who, just like everybody else, wants to belong, except maybe unlike somebody who belongs to a loving relationship, they belong to a DV relationship. And so then they start conforming their behavior to save that primary human need of an intimate relationship in service of that sort of belongingness. There is a fascinating study that was done in 2011 of 25 heterosexual couples. The male was being housed in the jail for the pendency of the case. The female, of course, was not, and there were multiple jail calls that were exchanged from the male to the female. And what's fascinating about this study is that it saw that every single one of these 25 couples jail calls followed this exact same cycle. It started out when the acute battering incident happens. It starts out where the victim's agency is up, she's upset, she's blaming the defendant, just like she should, right? From the outside looking in, that's what we think victims should do. But then as the cycle continues and the calls continue, what they see is that agency starts to erode, right? If you look down at number 3, then the predominant emotions are sadness, reflecting on the things that they did as a couple, saying people around them simply don't understand their relationship. And then once it gets to the end of the cycle, what happens? The couple is crafting the recantation plan at that point. They're giving each other instructions. And instead of the victim's agency being up at the start, then the couple's agency is up at the end. So the fascinating thing about this is that every single one of those couples jail calls followed this exact same cycle. And they talked about at the end of this study that recantation is a byproduct of the actions of sophisticated perpetrators. Sometimes we take cases less seriously when we see that recant, but actually what we should do is double down, because that kind of recant shows this highly sophisticated manipulation strategy that perpetrators need to be held accountable for. So that's just kind of an indication that when you see a recant, that's not a case that should go to the bottom of the pile. That's one that should stay at the top. Oftentimes, I think recants make cases stronger than cases where the victim is not recanting, because usually there is no other explanation for the recant other than the DV dynamics. Figuring out what's going on in the life between the victim and the defendant can really help you understand why that recantation is happening. But frankly, pulling jail calls is huge in terms of figuring out why that recant is happening. So this is an indication of, hey, maybe if you're getting that kind of recant and there's lots of jail calls, get an expert in there to take a look at that and see if it's following this cycle. That same researcher talked about how about 80% of victims recant. We've got kind of numbers all over the board for where recants happen, but what we know is that they're really, really high numbers of recanting victims, which of course makes perfect sense when you read the research. And this is really interesting. So when they talk about victim non-participation in the process, there's multiple reasons why that would happen. Financial dependence, we'll talk about that in a little bit. That's a huge factor in why a victim wouldn't participate in the prosecution. Victims' belief that the crime isn't severe, problems with substance abuse, but here's the kicker for all of us, is that the victim's perceptions of poor criminal justice system response and poor access to advocates and other support systems is a huge aspect of victim not participating. So that just helps us double down on, we have to do more to help victims not participate, or help victims participate when we see a victim acting like she doesn't want to participate, right? There are multiple reasons for that, identifying those reasons, but the huge thing is make sure we are adequately responding to help the victim and helping give her services to go forward. You'll see a study a little bit later that advocates helping victims find services are huge in victims getting out of DV relationships. That same study talks about victims wanting to drop protection orders. Of course, we see that constantly, but here's the big thing. Even when there's that emotional attachment to the defendant, having access to tangible support such as victim assistance workers and the availability of videotape testimonies are huge in helping increase participation in prosecution efforts. So again, victim advocates are huge in getting through the criminal justice system and a victim's ability to get through the criminal justice system. It is not a user-friendly system, certainly for victims, and we need to do all we can to help them get through it. The videotape testimonies aspect of things, the article didn't really talk about why that was the case, but I think that's a good thing to kind of know and keep in our back pockets, is that showing a victim a videotape testimony can actually help them break that emotional attachment. I have some ideas about why that's the case. I would guess that a lot of that has to do with helping remind the victim of what they experienced. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but and I have an example of experiencing something very harrowing and then kind of forgetting it later, right? We have this predisposition, I think, as humans to sort of try to move on from these things that give us trouble in our lives. And trouble is, of course, too trite a word to use here, but nonetheless give us trouble, because I think we are hardwired biologically to do that. So just a thought on the videotape testimonies. The other huge thing about why victims stay is that fear is a huge aspect of domestic violence cases. We'll see later that fear of testifying can also be really huge in a victim's non-participation. But this particular study had a case study where the defendant threatened to burn the victim's mom's house down. He was still in custody. They had a trial set. He called her. He said, if you participate, I'm going to burn your mom's house down. She said, I won't participate. Unbeknownst to her, he gets out of custody. The very next day, goes to her mom's house, burns her mom's house down. What does she do? She recants. She completely disappears. She goes back to the relationship. And what she told researchers was, sometimes I feel safer when I live with him because I know where he is. Otherwise, I'm always afraid he's going to show up when I'm not expecting him. And this really kind of folds into this idea that it's less anxiety producing for a victim to attempt to live in the abuser's reality than to not. I think right now we have a really good way to kind of connect to this with what's going on with COVID. And obviously I know there is a lot going on, more so on the broader national discussion and international discussion right now, but I'm just going to use COVID as an example because what COVID represents for a lot of people is an unknown, right? We don't know when we're returning to work. We don't know when we're going to do jury trials. We don't know what to tell victims. We don't know, am I going to be home next month or here? We don't know what to do with our kids or our pets or what have you. And that sort of unknown, we used to be able to know what our calendars were going to look like in 4 months. We don't anymore at all. That sort of unknown causes people anxiety. Any sort of unknown like that. As humans, we want to know what to expect. And any sort of unknown like that is going to cause people anxiety. What we represent as the criminal justice system is an unknown to victims. They don't know if the DA is going to be helpful or not, or blow them off. They don't know if the victim advocate's going to connect them to resources or not connect them to resources. They don't know if the defendant's going to get probation and come right back and get mad at them for participating in the trial. And mad, of course, is again too trite a word, because the question is whether or not they're going to be even more violent or kill the victim this next time they get out of custody. They don't know if the case is going to be dismissed. What do they know? They know how to control, at least to some extent, what the defendant does. They know what sets them off, what doesn't. They know what things to say, what not to say, what things to do, what not to do. And so even though they know that there's abuse that comes with certain things, at least they know what to expect. Whereas when we take victims out of that knowing aspect and we expect them to deal with the unknown and the unknown of what the defendant will do because they are participating, we ask them to do something that is very psychologically damaging to every single human out there. Of course, just a quick note on PTSD when we go forward. We really don't talk about PTSD in the battered woman context, but of course the majority of women who are DV survivors suffer from PTSD. Depression, anxiety, of course, are huge numbers there as well. And when we look at the emergency room context, women who come to the emergency room for DV-related incidents typically are seen to have lower self-esteem, fewer social and financial resources than those who come for something that is not DV related. And that gives us a really good segue into talking about the role of economic reliance in the domestic violence context. It should be no surprise to anyone that economic reliance, that thing that controls every single thing that we do in life and what we can or can't do we have to work a 9 to 5? Do we not? Can we go on vacation next week? Can I not? Can I pay the bills? That influences domestic violence victims' ability to get out of DV relationships pretty much more than anything else, coupled with the psychology aspect of it. Studies talk about when women have a college degree, they have a greater probability of divorce in highly violent marriages than those that don't. And of course, what does that really boil down to? More economic opportunity for the women with a college degree, just because of how our system is set up. When we have more resources for women, they become less dependent on men, and they have more opportunities going forward, more ability to divorce in those highly violent relationships. Of course, back in 2014, the incident happened with Ray Rice, I should say domestic violence incident with Ray Rice, on camera abusing his then fiance, now wife. And the New York Times wrote an article about it that cited to Jackie Campbell, who I'm sure the majority of you know, a very highly cited and well-regarded researcher in the area of domestic violence. And she talked about how it's incredibly difficult to extricate yourself when you're financially dependent on the abuser. This, coupled with the psychological aspect, of course, gives rise to this kind of additive effect of how could we ever possibly expect a victim to get out of a DV relationship when basically the odds are stacked against them, not only psychologically, but also economically. So that leads us to the question of, we know all these things cause victims to stay in DV relationships, but are there things that we can actually do to increase victim cooperation? And the thing that we should all keep in mind is that victims generally want offenders prosecuted, but we usually don't see that until after the prosecution happens. And of course, there are multiple reasons why that's the case. Here's the thing, victims may often say publicly that they don't want the offender prosecuted, but then after the fact, they tell researchers, I do want him prosecuted and I want him to get DV treatment. A lot of that is self-preservation, right? We can't really expect a victim to stand up in court in front of their abuser and say, I want this guy to go to prison for as long as possible, because guess what? At some point he's getting out. And it's completely a crapshoot for that victim as to whether or not that abuser is going to come after her or not. So we have to expect that victims are going to be at the very least ambivalent about an offender prosecuted, but more often than not, probably not want it to happen. But here's the thing, when we talk to the researchers, when we see what they're seeing outside of the criminal justice context, outside of the courtroom, we see that the majority of victims are actually saying they do want the offender prosecuted and jailed. The majority of them want them arrested. And actually what we see is after trials happen, we see the numbers of victims who say they are happy about the court experience go up because it gave them a sense of control. And I think that it's hard to kind of reconcile those two things in our minds when we talk about mandatory arrest and taking the self-determination away from victims, but then also recognizing that it gives victims a sense of control to go forward. Those things seem like they should be mutually exclusive, but the research simply shows that that's not the case. No-drop prosecution policies obviously are something that kind of came about in the last 20 years in this country, but they've found to be extremely effective in benefiting the victim psychologically and helping create a sense of empowerment for the victim. Interestingly, what they show is that they alter or disrupt that balance of power, taking the power away from the defendant, ultimately giving more power to the victim and potentially lowering those future rates of violence. This is the San Diego case study I talked about, where they saw a dramatic decrease in DV homicides over the 10 years that they implemented the no-drop prosecution policies. Just a note too, for those who deal directly with victims in the trial context, send a subpoena every single time, regardless of whether the victim is cooperative. That takes the onus off the victim. It doesn't make the victim look like she's the one wanting to go forward with the prosecution. and helps protect her by showing that she is not the one who's the driver, right? The less we can make victims look like civil claimants, the better we protect them going forward. That's not to say that all of this is not to say don't listen to the victim's wants and desires and what they want, right? Every time you have the opportunity to listen to a victim, listen to them. Doesn't mean you got to agree with them, and be honest about not agreeing. The worst thing you can do is sugarcoat things, but nonetheless, take the onus off the victim. I mentioned at the outset this fear of testifying in court. Interestingly, research has found that victims were sometimes more afraid of testifying in court than they were of the abuser, specifically afraid that they weren't going to be adequately prepared by the prosecutor to testify in court. And in one study, it showed that the strongest predictor of a guilty verdict in a misdemeanor case was how many times the prosecutor met with the victim before trial. And if the victim meets with a victim advocate, cooperation is going to increase substantially. So here's the thing. The takeaway from this is meet with victims, meet with victims, meet with victims, right? Make that person as comfortable with you as they possibly can. There is only one way to do that. It's by sitting down with them face to face. I know it's harder now with COVID and things have gotten disrupted in that sense, but nonetheless, you are a person, you are a resource for them. You should be that resource as much as that person needs, right? Their entire life has been disrupted, and the more that you can help them work through that, the better. All of the research basically says the exact same thing about expedient prosecution. The faster the case goes through the system, the higher the likelihood of conviction, and the lower the likelihood the abuser is going to be able to pressure the victim. That's kind of self-explanatory. It's why a lot of jurisdictions have fast-track programs for domestic violence cases. But of course, the time frame in which a victim is most likely to be receptive to help is going to be shortly after that acute battering incident. When the case continues, victims start to minimize the incidents to justify returning to relationships. So when I read this research, I thought about something in my own life that's completely unrelated to domestic violence. So about 2 years ago, I climbed Mount Evans, not the like little quarter-mile climb from the parking lot, but like the legit climb the whole way. And we lost the trail a bunch of times. I was with my fiance at the time. We lost the trail a bunch. We had to do some like class 3 climbing, which really I was not prepared for. Then a storm rolled in. We literally were enveloped in fog. I could not see more than 5 feet ahead of me. I had to climb down this cliff that had like a 300-foot drop to the left-hand side on my belly, like run across a ravine that was like a sheer drop on either side with a total of maybe 6 feet or 6 inches that I had to run across. It was super scary, right? And I remember sitting after that happened, I remember sitting there drinking a beer with my, he was my boyfriend at the time, and we were talking about how scary it was. I remember that, and I remember talking about it being really scary, but I don't really remember feeling the feeling of fear the way I did at that time. And this is the really interesting part, is now 2 years later, we have talked multiple times to each other about, oh, Mount Evans wasn't that bad. We could do it again. Maybe we should hike that again. Like, even though at the time we were like, I will never, ever, ever do that again. Over time, my brain has minimized how bad that was and how scary it was for me to help me say, oh, I can face my fears. I can do that again. It really wasn't that bad. That is a very minor example in my own life of what happens in the domestic violence relationship, not including all the psychology surrounding the relationship aspect there. So just think about those things that happen in your own life when you recognize that, you know, the farther you get away from that incident, the less the victim's going to view it as bad as it initially seemed. It's just what our brains are doing. And here's the thing. The better the relationship between the prosecutor and the victim advocate and the victim, the more the victim is going to cooperate, right? That's going to be largely predictive of cooperation, but the relationship has to be a particular way. You've got to approach it with sincerity, empathy, got to be straightforward, can't sugarcoat things, don't lie to the victim, don't say things will be okay, whatever, and be matter of fact about what your goals are, what her goals are. Sometimes those are not going to be the same thing. Same exact thing here. Practices of increasing cooperation are same throughout the research. The thing that doesn't work, increasing burdens put on victims. Again, don't treat the victim like a civil claimant. This is the study I talked about. There were two groups of women. One had domestic violence advocates, one did not. The advocacy group got these advocates who were like straight out of school. They had 10 weeks of training. They helped connect them to resources. And what they found is that the advocacy group was able to get out of the abusive relationships when they wanted to end them, whereas the groups that didn't have advocates were not able to do that. The thing is, support is everything for a DV victim, and the role of advocates is huge in providing that support for victims. The more you can connect victims to resources, the more they're going to be able to get out of these relationships, which ultimately is our goal, right? Is to get victims out of DV relationships. The probability of victim cooperation, interestingly, is better predicted by the conduct of the prosecutor than by anything the victim does or anything the defendant does. Providing the victim a sense of empowerment is going to be huge in helping the victim move forward through the relationship and cooperate with the domestic violence prosecution. The huge thing to be aware of is don't use the cycle of violence as a model that is this cognitive heuristic, a stereotype that we apply to every single victim. Treat victims as unique. That's a tool, absolutely. The cycle of violence is a tool to help you understand what's going on, but that's not the end of it. There is a lot more going on for that victim. There's a lot more going on in the relationship, and treat each and every victim uniquely. Don't stop just because investigating what's going on in their life just because you think this is a typical situation. Nothing is typical. Nobody is the same. Nobody fits the same subset of data. Keep that in mind and don't fall in the trap of applying those types of stereotypes to victims. Empathy, of course, is going to be huge in any sort of context where somebody experiences trauma. Certainly when someone experiences the trauma of a domestic violence relationship, it's going to be huge in facilitating change, helping them move past those relationships, and it's found to be the most important factor in victim satisfaction and countering victim satisfaction regarding police. I read a statistic once and I could not find where I read it. I promise you I read it, but I didn't put it in here simply because I couldn't find the site for it. And I try to cite everything I put. But the statistic I read is that if you show empathy to a victim, even if they are not in agreement with what you're talking about, they are 90% more likely to participate in the prosecution. So empathy can be huge in a victim sticking with you, even if the two of you end up disagreeing. It allows the victim to fully disclose the abuse. Pointing out their strengths is a huge part of that and helping them to be empowered to make their own decisions. And here's the thing, you gotta let the victim tell their story, right? That helps them work through what happens to them. We're not therapists, certainly. I'm sure some people on this call actually are therapists, but our role for the most part in the criminal justice system is not to act as therapists, but knowing how to connect with people that same way can really be helpful in helping victims move past these relationships. Ultimately, beyond somebody going to prison, beyond somebody getting a conviction, whatever, the point of this is helping the victim move past this abusive relationship that is something that is following them and has followed them for much of their life. There's a recommended approach in the literature of how you actually do this. And what you start out with is active and empathic listening. Active listening meaning ask questions, make them open-ended, make sure you use that sort of FETI model of not asking, why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? Don't be accusatory, just be open-ended. Listen carefully, listen to what they say, indicate interest with head nods and saying, that kind of thing. Adequately and accurately reflecting the victim's feelings. If the victim tells you they feel a particular way about themselves, reflecting that back to them about it sounds like that was really hard for you, that kind of thing. Maintaining eye contact is huge. If you've ever talked to somebody, I have a really good friend who, whenever I tell her things about what's going on in my life, she looks around and I always think she's not paying any attention to me, right? I still, to this day, we've been friends since we were 14. I'm 32 now. I still have no idea if she pays attention when I listen to me. It bugs the, stuff out of me. So, and then listening with soft eyes. This is something that Chris Wilson also talks about. Be cognizant of what your face looks like when you're listening to a victim. I am somebody who my face contorts when I'm trying to understand something or when I'm reading. People think I'm really mad because of what my face does. I have a hard time controlling my facial expressions, but I gotta think about that when I'm listening to a victim. Soften my eyes, don't furrow my brow. Victims will be much more likely to tell you what's going on. If you have hard eyes, if you narrow your eyes, if you furrow your brow, if you set your jaw, they're going to shut down. So know that every single one of those pieces of body language is going to be huge for a victim. Acceptance without judgment. These people, these individuals you will meet, have met, have had criticism for their entire lives or for their entire relationship with this individual who is now abusing them. Or has abused them, that they are stupid for staying in those relationships, they should get out. What your role is accept that, right? Don't judge the choices they've made. Don't judge the fact they're still in relationships. The relationships that are abusive, recognize that there's a lot that goes into why they're still in those relationships, and just accept it, right? No judgment whatsoever when you're listening to a victim. Identifying victims' strengths is going to be huge as far as empowering a victim. Just a quick story about this. Back in March, I did a trial with a 17-year-old victim. She really struck me from the first time I met her about how intelligent she was. And I said that to her sincerely. Every time I saw her, I was like, man, I just am so impressed by how smart you are. You are such a smart kid. You got your shit together, that kind of thing. And it is crazy to see or wild to see how she transitioned throughout the pendency of the case to being empowered by the time we actually got to trial. Showing those kinds of strengths, identifying them and reflecting them back for victims is really helpful, even though it may seem trite in the moment. Do it sincerely, but do it often and work to identify those strengths and reflect them back to the victim. And treat the victim as an expert. Like I said before, every victim is unique. They know their story. You don't know their story. They are not a stereotype. Honor the fact that they are trying to gain control in their life and what they've gone through to get to that point. And then recognize that leaving abusive relationships is a process, right? There are stages, the stages of a bonding model that one of the researchers talks about how they've got to work through these stages to get to the point of leaving the abuser. And when you come into contact with a victim, it can be at any one of these stages. So don't expect somebody is going to be at any single stage. Couple sentencing considerations, and then we'll kind of wrap up. So a lot of what we hear in DV relationships is this. It wasn't DV when you hear from defense attorneys. It wasn't actually DV. He's not a DV guy. He's actually just an alcoholic. He needs alcohol treatment. It is true that there is a huge correlation between alcohol and substance abuse and domestic violence. That is true for criminality in general. Substance abuse and criminality go hand in hand, just in general across the board. It's also true that we see alcohol a lot in DV relationships. One study talked about 92% involved alcohol, 92% of cases involved alcohol. One says 38. That's kind of like a wild distinction, but you know, whatever. And then another study talked about it being present in 65% of DV homicides within a 3-year period, which is actually a pretty high number when we talk about homicides. And the odds of male to female aggression are going to be higher on days when somebody drank than when they didn't. The other thing is alcohol and drug abuse are predictive of re-abuse and recidivism in DV offenses. I am guilty of looking at criminal histories for DV cases and only looking at prior assaults or prior DV offenses or maybe felonies, right? I typically just skim over the DUIs. It turns out I'm doing myself, the victim, and the defendant a disservice and skipping over those DUIs because just one prior arrest is going to double the re-abuse rate from 20 to 40%. So keep that in mind. It's a huge part of the recidivism and can be that kind of treatment can be effective in reducing domestic violence. In one study where there was alcoholism involved, partner violence significantly decreased for 6 months after treatment. For those who remain sober, re-abuse dropped to 15%. But the fact of the matter is that substance abuse treatment in and of itself is not enough to prevent re-abuse. It has to be coupled with domestic violence treatment. And when those two things come together, then you have those higher rates of reducing recidivism than if you just do drug and alcohol treatment. So this is some research to have in your back pocket when you're confronted with that idea of it's just an alcohol problem. It is an alcohol problem, and it's also a DV problem, right? Those two things definitely go hand in hand. On the contrary, there is no direct correlation between DV and mental health. Batterers are no more likely to be mentally ill than the general population, and battering generally is not responsive to mental health treatment. It's not been found to be the cause of abuse. Interestingly, there have been many, many studies that tried to validate any sort of classification of a battering propensity or identify a personality type that goes along with battering or a mental illness that goes along with battering, and every single one of those studies have failed. It's simply there isn't a correlation there. Domestic violence is kind of a thing unto itself, and there is no kind of mental health component across the board. It doesn't mean that an individual doesn't have a mental health component, but the point is there is no mental health component across the board for every sort of domestic violence abuser. The other thing to just kind of note is when we get to those high-level abusers, they're not going to respond to treatment. So I'm somebody who I really try to push treatment as much as I can. I try to use jail and prison as a last resort because ultimately the better we can do to prevent recidivism with treatment, I think the more we're doing for society. That's my personal opinion. But the fact of the matter is when we get to high-level abusers, we simply don't see the response to treatment. Access to firearms is going to be huge in every single DV case. We do have the statute from 2013 that talks about firearm relinquishment. Statewide, that statute's just not quite doing enough. There are things in play to help make it better. We have to kind of just wait for the subsequent legislative sessions to keep pushing those to make the firearm relinquishment more effective and be effectuated better. But the fact of the matter is, when there are firearms present, it highly increases lethal violence. We also know that when somebody was previously assaulted or threatened with a firearm, they're 20 times more likely to be murdered by their abuser. And in fact, the majority of guns that are present in domestic violence cases where someone shot their partner, those guns are typically illegal based on a prior DV conviction or a protection order being in place. So we got to do more on firearms. The way the statute is written, we kind of have to just do some digging to figure out if there are firearms that are in the home based on a number of Fifth Amendment considerations, and I could go on and on. This is a whole training in and of itself, but firearms cannot be overlooked in domestic violence relationships. A couple last notes about victim perception of the offender. Turns out victims' perceptions of an offender's dangerousness are actually usually spot on. They're good predictors of subsequent re-victimizations. However, that does not correlate into a victim being a good predictor of how a case should be prosecuted. So even though, so if a victim says, you know, the offender is dangerous, lend credence to that. They are probably right. But that doesn't mean that if they say, oh, well, he just needs treatment, then they're right about that, right? So understand that those are two different things. Low-risk offenders across the board are unlikely to re-abuse, but again, high-risk offenders need to kind of have, at least based on the research, need to have the imposition of significant sanctions, including incarceration, because the majority of those will re-abuse, regardless of whether or not they're prosecuted. There was a study that was done, I believe it was in Great Britain, if I remember correctly, back in 2006, where they talked to a number of DV offenders and identified these potential triggers to change. And what they saw is when those DV offenders, who were all male in that particular study, saw a desirable sequence of events, at least what they saw to be a desirable sequence of events, failing to take place, like the partner trying to leave the relationship or challenge to that male being ahead of the household, that's when they were most likely to change. But what that goes along with is the most potential for the offender to reassert his control and become more violent. So what we see at the same time that the trigger to change happens, and then you see the offender maybe being able to somehow address the abuse, we also see the violent tendencies increasing and the potential for violence increasing. Some of those participants, interestingly, said that a criminal justice sanction or even just a threat of a sanction actually provided the incentive to seek help. So certainly there's got to be something, or at least this study indicates there's got to be something that goes along with those triggers to change to actually help somebody seek help. So here's my information. Again, my name is Lise Rennerstrom. I'm at the Boulder DA's office. Send me an email, give me a phone call, whatever. Let me check the chat box really quick. I know we're right on time. And I don't see any questions.
Okay, Lise, I think they're just coming to me. We
Okay.
definitely do have some.
Okay.
We have a few requests for the handouts. I did let folks know that we'll put the whole presentation up on YouTube probably a little later today or tomorrow.
Okay.
A specific request for a copy of the recantation process graph.
Okay.
Would love to know more about the videotaped testimonies enhancing victim participation.
Okay.
And
that's actually, those are both in the same, the graph and assuming the graph that's being talked about is the jail call graph.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that's the same study as the videotape testimony. So I can get that, that's published online, and I can go ahead and get that study over to you, Kirsten.
Yeah, I can send, we have another request for just a copy of the overall presentation. And then I think maybe one of the questions is, how does that work? Like, you videotape a victim testifying in court, and then later on, while the offender, like then later on, it's available to watch it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my takeaway from that study, when they talked about videotape testimonies, I think they were using the word testimonies loosely. I think what that really was trying to identify was things like body cam interviews of a victim. So ensuring that interviews of victims are taped rather than just being stated in a police report kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, and folks can dig into that study a little more. And then we have in the section about letting victims tell their story, please speak to the discovery aspect. I think the question being, right, is it how much is discoverable or what have you?
Oh, okay. Certainly, I mean, anytime a victim gives some new or material information related to a case that's discoverable, I think that is a really good question, and that's a really good thing to be cognizant of. I think, things that are not related to that case, if the victim wants to talk about something that happened when they were a kid that really doesn't have any bearing on the case, but helps them in their catharsis or working through something, I think there's an argument that that's discoverable. I will tell you this: I am somebody who is who goes on the side of more discovery is better. I don't ever want to hide things. I don't want to look like I'm hiding things. And so if I learn new information, I tend to discover it and have an investigator put it in a report. But that is to say, what I try to tell victims before we have any sort of discussion that's going to go beyond the offense that's actually being prosecuted is be upfront about the fact that that can go in discovery. I've not had a victim have an issue with that in talking through what they've been through in their life so far. But that doesn't mean that there are victims, that doesn't mean all victims wouldn't have an issue. So just kind of being upfront about that discovery aspect. If you're like me and tends to say more is better in terms of kind of not hiding the ball, that kind of stuff, just kind of be upfront about that aspect is what I would say.
Yeah, I've had debate or experienced debate about, if you're safety planning with a victim, is that discoverable in the sense that, if they are doing a safety plan, it implies that something has happened. But does the defense really need to know giving away the specifics of a safety plan is sort of makes it not helpful.
And I agree with that. I mean, with safety planning kinds of stuff, things that are not factual, but more like actually trying to keep the victim safe, I would fight tooth and nail not to have that discovered. I don't think there is any reason whatsoever why a defense attorney would need that. So certainly I think it's a case-by-case basis. What I was kind of referencing is more of like the factual aspect of things kind of surrounding the offense, or maybe things that led to the offense.
Okay. Awesome. That's a great clarification. Thanks. I appreciate that. Those were the questions that we had. And again, I think folks have Lee's and my information, and later today or at the latest tomorrow, I'll be able to pass along any of the citations that she's able to get to me.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lise, and thanks everyone. I hope that this was a great kickoff to your day. We here at COVA appreciate the work that all of you are doing on behalf of crime victims, and wish everyone to have a wonderful weekend. And yeah, happy Friday Eve.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.